Zeff has been one of the most powerful cards in the One Piece TCG, specifically for the Blue Nami Mill archetype. It's been one of the cornerstone cards that allowed for recursion, a lot of just threat angles in terms of being aggressive with its abilities, but for now, it's in the back burner. It's kind of a thing of the past, a relic of a format long ago, and that's what I wanted to talk about today. I wanted to talk about why Zeff is no longer good in Nami, and maybe there is a situation where it could come back, but with these things I'm going to address, we have to have certain elements come back or wane away in order for the chef to cook again. Now, of course, if you're a Zeff lover and you had a moment where you won off of a Zeff hitting your opponent and milling 7, you gotta leave a like on the video. We've all had moments like that, and I have plenty of clips and videos on the channel of me doing so. But again, leave a like on the video if you had a good moment with Zeff. But if you want to see me talk about more Nami cards, you gotta leave a comment down below. Maybe you want me to talk about how good Boodle is or something, then you gotta let me know in the comment section. But Zeff itself, from the top, I mean, 5 cost, 6k power, 1k counter, and it says as an East Blue type that you can add 1 Dawn to it, and when this character attacks and deals damage to your opponent's life, you may trash 7 cards from the top of your deck. So again, high risk, high reward, and the risk is the fact that, you know, you're paying 5 Dawn to have an effect like this come on. If you can hit a swing in there, you're milling 7 cards. It will definitely be worth it if you can hit that swing. But the on play also says return up to 1 character with the cost of 3 or less to its owner's hand. So it's symmetrical. You could bounce one of your opponent's threats, you could bounce your own, but 3 or less is pretty restrictive. And you may trash 2 cards from the top of your deck. Now, I will note, if this character said with the cost of 4 or less, this would probably still be a staple in this deck. You would probably build almost a whole Nami deck around this card, because this would be one of your best cards ever, just because of the fact that it could bounce 4 or less. But 3 or less pretty much makes it so you're bouncing like Perro Sparrows. You're not really bouncing like 1 cost searchers or anything like that. You're really bouncing your own Kayas and your Mr. ones, or at least you were in kind of the formats where it was being played. So, you know, also being able to trash 2 cards on the top of your deck is really nice, just having that immediate mill. But again, that's trashing 2 cards. That's not adding cards, right? So it is a lot of kind of disadvantage in that sense. It does advance your board plan, but again, 5 Dawn to just mill 2 cards, that's what it is really in a lot of situations. And that's where I kind of can lead into the whole Kaya situation, where you can have these insane plays where you go Kaya on 1 Dawn, then you play Zeff to bounce the Kaya back to your hand, you mill 2 more, so you've milled 4 cards at this point. Then you play the Kaya out again, you milled 6 cards. So essentially 7 Dawn to mill 6 cards. Not bad when you have that whole kind of range going. And honestly, plays like that have won plenty of games for Nami players out there. I can think of games myself, and I'm sure you can as well as a Nami player, but it's just not strong enough anymore because the format is too fast. I mean, along with the East Blue type, there is something that is being played now in Apis that can also look up for Zeff. With the deck now playing the 4 Perfume Fumers and 4 Impel Down All-Stars, there are a lot of targets that can allow Apis to function and look for East Blue type cards like Zeff. So even with the ability to search for it, it's not really as played, and it's for 3 big reasons that we're going to head into today. Now, of course, if you disagree with these reasons or you think there is a bit more nuance to it, then again, let me know in the comment section down below. We are all here to learn. But the first big reason is the fact that Katakuri is no longer in the metagame. And it's really because of the reject ban, right? So reject being one of the key pieces in that deck, and honestly one of the key parts about that deck being able to handle itself and really swing itself in the metagame, where you have these crazy turns where not only are you able to deal with characters 5 costs or less, so this was a fantastic piece of removal against Zeff, but you know, your opponent having 1 life card, you deal 1 damage to that opponent for free. So you play 10 cost Mom, maybe another Mom, you deal some damage in there, all of a sudden reject takes that last card, and then you start swinging in with your Moms. Like, this deck had a lot of pressure with it. And so because of the reject ban, the Katakuri deck really just sunk in terms of popularity and in playability in general. And then one day it may come back, but for now, with the slow kind of build up mid-range style of play that Katakuri had, this was the type of deck that Zeff really punished the most. And with Katakuri being really big, like in terms of playability in OPO4, heck, even in OPO5 with Sakazuki everywhere, it still was a very highly played deck. And so these are the type of matchups that Zeff was able to take advantage of. You were able to play it. They didn't really have a lot of removal for it. You know, they forced them to have the reject, but also another option was the Gadatsu. But even Gadatsu you could play around, because it says on play, KO up to one of your opponent's characters with a cost equal to or less than the number of life your opponent's had. So all this meant is that if you wanted to play around the Gadatsu, you just took an early hit. You went down to 4 life, maybe got a free trigger out of it, then you played your Zeff, and then the Gadatsu did nothing. Right, obviously in the NL matchup, you have something like Yamato that KOs a character equal to the amount of life that both players have. And so that really is a card that can't really deal with bigger threats, but that's a card that generally is going to be able to kill anything in the Nami deck. You're not dealing any damage to your opponent. They're just going to be stuck at 5. And so in that yellow matchup, there is a lot of back and forth. There's a lot more aggression here, but something like Katakuri being good in the metagame was really helpful for a card like Zeff, because this is the type of deck that played threats like Gadatsu, 5 cost 6k, that KO'd something and went 1 for 1 every time, right? And with that in mind, you were able to play around it, you were able to play the Zeff, and pretty much as long as it swung into your opponent once, it forced them to take out like 3, sometimes 4 cards out of their hand just to counter out. And that was the type of value that you needed out of it. Even if you didn't get to mill your own cards, that just meant those are cards that your opponent cannot deploy in the future for a future Zeff, or have the options to pitch out to other triggers that they have, or just in general have the option to use as future characters for them to play. Like, again, just having a matchup like this in the metagame was so crucial to the success of Zeff. But not only was the success of Katakuri really important for the viability of Zeff, but the success of RP Law is also a big downside for Zeff. So with Katakuri in the metagame, we had Zeff really succeed, but with RP Law in the metagame, I mean, Zeff is just one of the worst plays that you can make at 5 Dawn. RP Law really, again, one of Nami's worst matchups, and has been for as long as it's been printed, just because of its ability to cheat out, go wide, and really force you down in terms of the cards that you have. And it's one of these matchups where I think many Nami players will tell you, you need to see like multiple white snakes. You need at least like 3 of your triggers to be actually good, sometimes 4. Heck, there are matchups that we've seen on camera where Nami players have had 4 to 5 really good triggers, and the art, like, heck, even like drawing cards, 3 to 4 of them are drawing cards, 1 of them bounces, and the Law deck will still beat the Nami player. So it can be really hard with its Dawn -3 bouncing a character with 3 power lower, because you spend 5 Dawn to maybe bounce a Kaya, maybe bounce a card that they're playing, but that card that they played didn't even spend Dawn on it, first of all, right? You're dropping like a 3 cost or lower back to their hand, but they're placing something that's like 4 costs from their hand. So a lot of times you can't even bounce something like that. You're bouncing something smaller, right? Which you don't really want to do. So you bounce your own character back to your hand, and that's for 5 Dawn. Then what they do is they just play a Gordon on 1, take your Zeff down to 3k power, and that immediately meets the threshold of the Law player. And I think that's what's really the frustrating part when you're playing Zeff against a list like this. And it really goes to show you that it just isn't worth it to pay that much Dawn with Zeff to have such a minimal effect against a matchup like this. We even saw in OPO5 against the Sakazuki matchup that the Zeff was really a glorified 1k counter. You never really resolved the Zeff at all, because pretty much like the turn you resolve Zeff, your opponent would just untap, play something like 7 cost Porcelino, and just deal with the Zeff that way. Like it's just, there wasn't really a time that was good to play the Zeff in that matchup at all. There weren't really great targets for it, being able to only bounce 3 or less. Like, you can't bounce Kuzan, you can't bounce Lucci, you can't bounce Sabo. So again, like, matchups over time have just really like outdone the bounce restriction that Zeff had. And again, RP Law is really the kind of the peak of that, where we can't be inefficient with the Dawn that we're using. We don't have the time or the resources afforded to us to be able to abuse something like Zeff, especially with the lack of Mr. ones in the deck right now. We don't get the opportunity to recur something like Gum Gum Gavel to hold up these tighter Dawn sequences where we can play Zeff and still have the ability to hold up like Gum Gum Gavels for backup. A lot of our events now are 2 costs with Snake Dances, Love Love Mellows, White Snakes. So we on average are spending more Dawn over the course of the game across many turns, whereas maybe on fewer turns we're spending like on 1 or 2 turns we're spending a lot of Dawn. Over a course of like many turns, we're spending more Dawn on average per turn because of those 2 Dawns. So 5 is a really big investment, especially if it's going to get punished with something like Trafalgar Law. And the last reason that Zeff isn't good is because of something like Gloriosa that has provided us with a more efficient engine to really move forward through the deck. I mean, Gloriosa being one of the better searches that we've come across, Buggy being one of the key ones we've had so long, being able to get us Impel Down All-Stars, Airbrick Brickfist, and Deathwink. Buggy now is being outclassed by something like Gloriosa because it grabs so many cards that we already have access to. I mean, it grabs Margaret, which is one of the newer additions, being a blocker that on play you draw a card. Doesn't have a counter on it, but I feel like this card would be absolutely bonkers with a counter on it. So great, you're able to draw a card there. So immediately 3 Dawn is a lot less of an investment. And so you could search for the kind of Margaret, and that's a 4 Dawn investment to pull a card out of your hand, out of your deck. And then you play a Margaret to draw another card. So it's immediately like you spent 4 Dawn to draw 2 cards, and you spent a lot less Dawn, right? So you spent 4 versus 5, which genuinely is a lot. And then you've drawn 2 cards instead of milled 2 cards. Big difference because you gain access to the card. And now Margaret, obviously, you can play on a future turn as well. You could just draw it and use it as something like gavel fodder or whatever. And if you're playing something like Gum Gum Rain, I know a lot of Nami players in my comment section have talked about how they're playing some number of copies of Gum Gum Rain. This is a great target for that as well. And another target that's newer to the deck is also Snake Dance, 2 costs that says counter up to one of your leader characters gains plus 4,000 during this battle, then return up to one of your characters to its owner's hand. So it can just be a blank 4K counter. You don't mandatorily have to return the one character to your hand, but it's an additional way to recur something like a Gloriosa or something like a Margaret. And honestly, when this card was first spoiled, if you remember in my video, I was talking about how you could actually bounce something like a Zeff with this, right? So a lot of people were thinking about this in combination with Zeff, where you play that, you give your leader plus 4K, and then next turn you could play the Zeff, mill, bounce, whatever, and use it all over again. And then the trigger, you may return one of your characters to its owner's hand. So even the trigger allows you, as part of its cost, to return one of your characters. There's no cost restriction on it, so you could bounce your Zeff as well. But in this case, you're probably just going to be bouncing your Margaret, your Gloriosa, your Kaya. In some rare cases, your Mr. 1, if you're playing that in your list as well. And then you return up to one of your opponent's characters with the cost of 5 or less, which is very valuable, being able to bounce Sabos, Queens, and stuff like that. So Snake Dance being a very valuable target, Love Mellow being the other target that Gloriosa has. So in a lot of cases with the cards that you're getting off of Gloriosa, it's even better on rate because Zeff comes down at 5 and mills you 2 cards, whereas Gloriosa comes down on 1, draws you 1 card. Then on average, the cards that you generally are getting from it are also drawing you a card. You are getting another Margaret that is then drawing you a card. You are getting a Snake Dance, which is kind of like drawing you a card, like you're returning a character back to your hand to use again. You could be drawing a Love Mellow, which also draws you another card. And so you start to see how the wheels turn in terms of how it's more efficient to then be using the Dawn on your opponent's turn to be drawing these cards instead of proactively using your Dawn on your turn to mill these cards over. You're not even drawing them, and you're giving your opponent information based on now what you don't have access to. You spent 5 Dawn. That's 5 Dawn you don't have access to. Now they know what you can and can't play. Like you might be on your 7 Dawn turn, you play your Zeff, and all of a sudden they know you have 2 Dawn up. That means you don't have Deathwing. You have 1 2 cost event or 2 1 cost events. Like it's a lot more restrictive. Whereas if you held up a bunch of Dawn and then you played a Zeff's worth of mana in terms of your Gloriosa and your events, obviously Gloriosa you would have to play on your turn. But then if you held up something like a Snake Dance to keep it going, then there's a lot more variability in terms of what your opponent can play around, wants to play around. And so you can kind of trick them, make them play around different options a lot more than before. So again, Gloriosa providing you a lot more efficient value per its mana cost, Dawn cost, Magic player here, and really just elevates the value that the Nami deck can force out. And that's really why Zeff just isn't that great, with the yellow matchup really waning in terms of Katakuri, it just not being viable at all. And then you have RP Law just shutting down the Nami matchup and really just devaluing Zeff, like to just being as valuable as a 1-cost Gordon to a leader ability. Like imagine paying 5 Dawn to mill 2 cards and then it just gets shut down, right? Like would you pay 5 Dawn to mill 2 cards? Absolutely. I hope none of you said yes to that. Would you pay 5 Dawn to draw 2 cards? I would still say no, you would not pay that cost, but it's a lot better than milling 2 cards because you don't get access to that. So Zeff, just the high risk, high reward. is too much risk right now. It's not that rewarding to play a card like this, and which is why it's kind of left behind. Now, of course, if we see RP Law getting banned, maybe some buffs to yellow and the more mid-range plan, maybe not the aggressive plan that NL has, but the mid-range plan that Katakuri has, then we could see something like Zeff come back. So yeah, you know, I'm not selling my altards just yet, but for now they go into the trade binder and we leave Zeff for another East Blue meta. Maybe in OP09 we could see a big comeback depending on what's going on, especially with something like an activated ability here. If we see something like Blackbeard go really big in the metagame, then having that optionality of like the kind of attack trigger on it, it could be really powerful. But I imagine Whitebeard being in black, it's going to have plenty of removal anyway, so I can't pretend like it's going to be a good matchup in general. But let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Are you still playing Zeff in your Nami list? Do you think Zeff still has viability in a world of RP Law, Moria, and all this bottom decking and removal? I gotta hear your thoughts down below. But that's been me talking about some Zeff. Let's keep the mill train going in OP07.